Toto, I have a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore.
The stuff that dreams are made of.
Fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy night.
You're tearing me apart! He's looking at you, kid.
Well, nobody's perfect.
All right, Mr. DeMille, I'm ready for my close-up.
Hello and welcome to Revisiting the Golden Age, a journey through classic Hollywood. I'm Josh Martin, and welcome back to the show. This is episode 6, and yes, I have been gone for a month and a half now about. I don't always tell people, what I do when I'm not, writing and recording stuff, but until last month, I was a undergrad student in college, finished up with that now, and finished up some other stuff that I had to get ready, and that took up a lot of my time, and I didn't get to record many podcasts or write much of anything. So, but we're back now, and should have more episodes on a regular basis. One more somewhat significant change to announce. I will not be doing the original chronological order that I suggested when the podcast started. So originally I said we were going to go, okay, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, go in that order. It's going to be a big jumble now. You might get an episode from about a film from the 1940s one week, and then the 60s, then go back to the 30s. So it gives you a bit more variety, and it gives guests a wider range of films to talk about. And so, yeah, and today's guest, welcoming back to the show, the friend of the show and now 3-time guest, film inquiry writer and host of the latest podcast on film inquiry, Jesse Nussman. Hey, Jesse, how's it going?
Good. Thank you for, tolerating me and having me back for a third time. That just really shows the bonds of our friendship right here. So
no, I'm always glad to have you on, and we always have great conversations, and I'm always happy to hop on the latest as well. We did what's the podcast we did a couple weeks ago on David Fincher's Mank, and talking about Orson Welles' Citizen Kane, and Pauline Kael and Andrew Sarris, and all kinds of fun stuff about
almost 2-hour podcast recording that somehow I had to whittle down to like 45-50 minutes. So
we went on that one. That was a digressive podcast of we were going out there with some of the stuff, but that was a delight to talk about. And yeah, so today we're talking about one of the sort of major films of the classic Hollywood studio era, from Warner Brothers Pictures and director Howard Hawks. It's The Big Sleep, with Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall. And so, yeah, this is one of sort of the highlights of the film noir genre that emerges in the sort of post-war era in America. It's an adaptation of Raymond Chandler's novel, and it's the first real appearance of Detective Philip Marlowe, who later appears in another great film. Obviously, I don't cover 70s films on here, but if you're looking for a recommendation from me, Robert Altman's The Long Goodbye with Elliot Gould, brings Marlowe back into the fold, and that is one of my favorite neo-noir films. And there's quite a fun relationship between The Big Sleep and some of the neo-noirs that emerged later in the 70s after sort of the heyday of film noir. This was both Jesse and I's first time watching The Big Sleep, but we're both have a sort of wide range of knowledge about the films of Howard Hawks in general. So we'll sort of bounce around the two, because Hawks is... to provide a bit of background on Hawks, he's sort of one of the major directors of the studio era, and also one of the first real filmmakers in Hollywood who's taken up by the French film critics at Cahiers du Cinéma. So that's Francois Truffaut, Jean-Luc Godard, all the people who write about the Hollywood studio films in the 1950s. And they sort of pick out these major directors. So Hitchcock, we've talked about Hitchcock a little bit on this podcast already. Hawks, Otto Preminger, these are all directors who are sort of considered the top craftsmen and auteurs of the Hollywood studio system. I'm sure some of my listeners know this already, and I'm just filling in knowledge, but wanted to give that background for anyone who is new to the world of Hawks and auteurist criticism. But first, Jesse, I wanted to get your reaction to the film. You just watched it this morning. You actually watched it more recently than I did. What did you think of The Big Sleep?
I mean, I really loved it, but I'm also kind of like a sucker for a good kind of grungy noir movie. I think it's actually really interesting you bringing up The Long Goodbye, because what an incredible double feature that would be for anyone who's not seen either of those movies. Because I mean, so much of The Long Goodbye is like, can Robert Altman take this like very 1940s specific kind of detective noir movie and kind of like funnel it through the prism of the culture of 1970s California, and I think kind of like mostly succeeds. So I don't know, I had to go on that little tangent of I think that's a fantastic double feature for anyone who kind of wants to see like I don't know what is so great and fun about these like very pulpy 1940s noir movies, but then also someone trying to, I mean, that Long Goodbye is basically a period piece at this point, but it's someone trying to kind of take the language of those movies and figure out a way to kind of modernize it, and the like contrast between old Hollywood and the sort of freedom of new Hollywood. But yeah, I really like this movie. I don't know how you feel about just like detective stories in general. This is like these are sort of my like guilty pleasure is the wrong word, but the kind of movies that like even if it's mediocre, I'm kind of gonna enjoy it.
Yeah,
and I don't know. I'm fascinated to talk about Howard Hawks as a figure, Humphrey Bogart as a movie star. I think this is just a movie that, you know, I don't know what your sort of expectations were going into it, but like the one thing I had kind of been aware of going into this movie is that it kind of doesn't make sense.
Oh,
and and to like kind of throw that out the window, but there's so much kind of style and fun to be had in kind of the casting and the filmmaking that you you can feel it sort of flying by the seat of its pants, but it's still immensely enjoyable and you just sort of roll with it. I mean, I'm also kind of a sucker for the mystery movie in which the mystery is sort of beyond even the kind of protagonist's comprehension. That's kind of why I love David Lynch movies. That's why I'm like one of the people who moves through this world that's just like Inherent Vice is a masterpiece, because like it's total nonsense. Like you know, going down a digression about that movie, like I got this like really great Paul Thomas Anderson book that just came out for my birthday, and there's like a whole chunk of that in Inherent Vice, and I was like trying to convince my girlfriend to watch it, and was just like, yeah, the movie's also like intentionally really convoluted and you're not supposed to be able to follow any of it. And she was just like, pass. There's no, like, that would infuriate me. But that this is kind of the OG version of that kind of aspect with mystery stories. And I think it's even funny that like Raymond Chandler, who wrote the novel this is based on, was basically like, I don't know what that book's about. Like I was kind of just making it up as I went along, and it was just like it doesn't make sense, but I think it's a testament to how much everything else works around it, that you just sort of roll with it and don't try and put the pieces together in a fashion that totally makes sense.
Yeah, no, I am fully with you on Inherent Vice. I try, a close friend of mine, I tried to get her to watch it, and she'll watch basically anything with me, but when it came to that one, I remember recommending that on this like list of movies I had, and I think that's the only one she's never finished, so I'll have to tell her that I mentioned that on this show. But Inherent Vice was when I took a class on American films in the 1970s, so the New Hollywood movement, which is what The Long Goodbye sort of fits in. There was a discussion of that sort of lineage from The Big Sleep to The Long Goodbye to Inherent Vice. I actually just finished reading the Inherent Vice, the book it was based on, which is a sort of naughty and confusing novel. I've seen that movie about 4 or 5 times now, I think, and at this point, I think I get most of it.
That's where I am.
But it's one of those films still where it's one you go in every time, you're like, okay, I have a familiarity with this. I know the bare bones of the plot. I will know what happens. And every scene ends up in this sort of oddly digressive format where it starts in one place, and then by the end of the scene, you think the movie's about something completely different, and then just sort of ties itself into a knot, and it's very, very complicated and very convoluted.
Well,
and
I also think, like, you know, this is maybe a discussion we can get into in a little bit about sort of like LA noir as a genre. But like,
Yeah.
I think the thing with this movie and with Inherent Vice, like, you can try and put it together, but it's sort of like Inherent Vice in particular, like, it's more about kind of what's going on around the edges and about sort of like,
it's about a state of mind.
Yeah,
it's about a sort of
and about this sort of like transitional period of like the counterculture 60s to the more sort of like paranoid Nixon era 70s, and just sort of like absorbing you in that atmosphere and having all these various signifiers of that transition happening all around you. And just as much, I think, a hallmark of kind of LA specific noir in general, or these ideas of these kind of larger than yourself conspiracies that don't really make sense, but are sort of evocative of a kind of fear and culture and underbelly that is sort of beyond your comprehension. You know, with this movie, like the 40s in general, and this you know, this sort of darkness under that kind of like post-war America. And I mean, this is even something that, you know, bringing up New Hollywood, like, this is a big part of like Chinatown. Like, I'm also reading this book on Chinatown, and like so much.
I read that book recently. Yep.
Yeah, and so much of that movie is just about kind of like evil exists in the world, and it's bigger than you, and like one person is not going to be able to stop it. And just these sort of like maniacal forces that we think of, you know, we think of kind of like Los Angeles and Hollywood in this period as being this very kind of like pure idealistic era. And I think the sort of fascination I have with these movies is sort of like, there is darkness and evil kind of all around you, and sort of like peeling back the edges of something and beginning to see that there's this whole dark world that you were previously unaware of, but like you're never gonna like fully defeat it or fully comprehend all of it. I mean, that's also something like I remember a film class in college, we watched Mulholland Drive, and of course the great David Lynch movie, and that's another very interesting example of this kind of LA noir. But I remember the professor like enjoying kind of asking everyone at the end of the movie like what everyone thought about it, and of course people are giving these like very complicated and symbolic readings, and I was just like the sucker in the class that like held up my hand and was like, it's not supposed to make sense, and was just like, it's in this and sort of like analyzing it through this tradition of these LA crime movies where there's just evil that is greater than you and conspiracies that are beyond your comprehension, and you are but just sort of like an insect inside this larger cog in this larger machine, and you're never going to like get to the bottom of it. It's a mystery movie in which like the dark reality is you are so insignificant, you are never going to be able to solve the mystery at its center.
Yeah. Or you do solve the mystery and you're still helpless to change anything anyways, a la Chinatown, which is sort of the most sort of devastating of the LA noir tradition. But yeah, I mean, there's certainly this sort of uncovering of a conspiratorial network of sort of these nefarious forces. And I think certainly Mulholland Drive I see is connected to that tradition, though a little different, because I think it's all of these sort of LA noirs are also inherently about Hollywood. They're city films, but Mulholland Drive is much more specifically about sort of the corrosiveness of that sort of Hollywood dream, or the corrosive nature of fame and wanting fame. And yeah, that one makes somewhat a little bit more sense to me, but also there's just stuff in there that I cannot explain, much like most of David Lynch's filmography. But there's Inherent Vice is sort of this great post 60s movie. And, the interesting connection between The Big Sleep and The Long Goodbye is that, at the end of The Big Sleep, there's a bit of a sense that everything is at least okay, which connects to sort of the necessity of classic Hollywood. Whereas Long Goodbye ends on one of the sort of most unforgiving notes and ironic. It ends with playing the song Hooray for Hollywood. So partially of its sort of original, almost ironic nature from what I've led to believe about that song. But yeah, these films are all part of a rich tradition. I would even say that Inherent Vice plays really well with Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, is this sort of post 69 sort of haze of dreams and fantasies and paranoid nightmares, and they deal with very different corners of the LA universe. But so yeah, all films that I would encourage any listeners to check out. But the other big thing about The Big Sleep is, we talked about sort of the incomprehensibility of the plot. And so I guess a little bit more background on the film itself. So Bogart plays Philip Marlowe. He's a detective. He's hired by this sort of wealthy man to investigate this sort of connection between the disappearance of someone connected to the family. The old man has two daughters, Vivian Rutledge, who's played by Bacall. She's sort of in charge of everything and sort of loosely connected at first. And then he also has another daughter who's caught in with some sort of unsavory characters. As the plot continues, Marlowe finds her in a sort of compromising situation. There's a gangster. Bacall's character comes more into focus. I saw this film about a week ago as prep for the podcast. I wasn't sure when we were going to record it yet. And, I actually, going into this morning, I had to go back and take a look at what the plot was again, because it really is both difficult to follow and essentially beside the point.
Exactly.
As you sort of hinted at. And so a little bit more background on the film itself. This was Bogart and Bacall's second film. They had made To Have and Have Not with Hawks before. I'm pulling most of this from IMDb trivia and sort of what I know from reviews from either critics, scholars, Roger Ebert's essays. But Hawks was sort of, this was when throughout the film, Bogart and Bacall in their first film had this sort of incredible chemistry, both on and off screen. And around this point was during the making of The Big Sleep was when I think Bogart splits from his wife and ends up marrying Bacall, who is much younger than him. But if you watch this film, it is clear that they have sort of an electric sexual chemistry with one another.
They're very sexy together.
It's and so yeah, granted, there was, as many critics will point out, basically every woman in this movie throws themselves at Philip Marlowe. There's a great scene at a bookstore with Dorothy Malone, who pops up in I think Written on the Wind in the 50s, and it is, the sort of delight of classic Hollywood filmmaking is that, everything had to be so chaste to sort of appease the Hays Code and all the people who were in charge of censorship. But the people who were in charge of censorship were either, sort of implicitly supportive of extreme innuendos or just kind of stupid, because there's so much just sort of implied in this movie by just suggestion, cuts. He goes into that bookstore and flirts a lot, and then we get a cut to the window, and we all know what that means if you've seen enough classic Hollywood films. But
or even the stuff in this movie that's maybe some of this is my own interpretation, but pornography is kind of part of the plot.
Yes.
To an extent.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like it's very subtly hinted at, although I think if you're just, you know, an adult who's moved through the world or have like seen enough of these you know, any kind of like crime detective movie, like you can kind of like put the pieces together into knowing that is a significant aspect of the plot.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's the whole thing is that the younger daughter is you know, on drugs. Drugs are a part of this too, which you wouldn't necessarily. That is certainly uncommon in 40s films, but the younger daughter played by Martha Vickers there's a sort of plot about photos of her in, you know, compromising. At least what we think is, you know, the viewer automatically goes, okay, they have some sort of illicit photos of her that she doesn't want to get into the wrong hands. So that's a big part of the plot as well. So, and also obviously there's the famous, which was apparently part of the sort of major alterations of the film, the scene where Bogart and Bacall talk about the going to the races or whatever, and there's like just the most like sexual dialogue you can imagine, all wrapped up in this like metaphor about racehorses, and it's incredible. But so there's two versions of the film, both of which are available now. You know, in the first version, apparently the plot is a little bit more explained, and then at a certain point, but there's also differences in performances between the two. But at a certain point, apparently Hawks decides that, you know, the audience doesn't really care, and so he's like, they're just really here to see, as Ebert says, this is all about seeing Bogart and Bacall, and so they cut out things that could further explain the story in the sort of instead shifting attention to the sort of relationship between the two of them, and sort of just the world of, you know, back and forth and, you know, unsavory characters popping in and out. And, you know, this is sort of the emergence, apparently. Hawks sort of realizes this at this point, and it becomes the emergence of a sort of Hawks tradition where narrative takes a backseat to sort of the stars of the film and the characters and this sort of world that Hawks creates. So just a quick run through of the sort of major Hawks films. He starts, you know, in the 30s with sort of some major films. In the late 30s, he makes, he's one of the sort of pioneers of the screwball comedy. So in the late 30s and early 40s, he makes Bringing Up Baby with Cary Grant and Katharine Hepburn. Cary Grant and Rosalind Russell in His Girl Friday. That's another major Hawks film. And also Ball of Fire with Gary Cooper and Barbara Stanwyck, all worth checking out. His other sort of major early film in the late 30s is Only Angels Have Wings with Cary Grant and Jean Arthur. One of my favorite sort of new to me viewings of the year. Hawks is notable for his sort of bouncing around from genre to genre. So he's the screwball master, obviously. Big Sleep is a noir film. You know, we've got Westerns later he makes with Red River and Rio Bravo, which is probably my favorite Hawks film and the sort of one of the sort of greatest films ever made. And so that's one of the ways in which sort of auteur criticism is applied to Hawks, in that, you know, he keeps the signature style while bouncing around from genre to genre. And yeah, I mean, there's sort of two key traditions. So you have on one hand, if you're sort of a Letterboxd reader, I would encourage everyone to check out the reviews of this film written by Peter Labuza, who's a sort of media industry scholar who's also written extensively on film noir, and Mike D'Angelo, sort of the great film critic. Both of them bring up a really salient point with this film, which is that it sort of includes much of Hawks's screwball tendencies within the confines of this detective story. And Jesse, I know from just browsing through your letterbox that you've seen some of the Hawks screwball films.
Yeah, definitely.
So I was curious on your thoughts on those films and maybe Hawks as a figure in general, and also sort of perhaps where you see connections to his other films in this film itself.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's interesting trying to apply the kind of auteur theory to him, because, you know, it's unlike someone like John Ford or Alfred Hitchcock. Like, it's easier to kind of connect the dots with filmmakers like that who kind of stick to sort of one genre. But Hawks I find interesting just because, like I said, any kind of movie genre that you can imagine, any kind of movie he's kind of made. Like, like even like, I know you ran through kind of like the major ones, but like horror movies, war movies, musicals. I mean, like you could kind of like throw a dart at just like any kind of movie, and he's probably like made some variation on it. And I don't know. I don't know how many. You know, I know someone like Steven Soderbergh is kind of a big fan of his, and like, I mean, Soderbergh's willing to kind of do weird experiments in a way that like Hawks kind of like firmly works within the studio system. But I mean, that kind of ethic of, I just want to kind of play around with a bunch of different genres. I don't know. I was actually going to ask you what your favorite one was. So I actually have not seen Rio Bravo. It's on my like HBO Max queue, but like every time I go to watch it, I'm like, I don't know. Do I have 3 hours to finish this?
It's very long. It is. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, His Girl Friday is maybe my favorite. Which, if anyone's never seen, I mean, if you're a fan of like I know Quentin Tarantino is a big fan of that movie. I have to assume Aaron Sorkin is. It's just
absolutely.
such a great dialogue movie, and is like, I don't know. I kind of love the comedies of that era, and I think that movie is such a work of speed. It's so fast, and people are just talking over each other and interrupting each other, and like, you almost have to have the closed captioning on to get every single like cast aside and like witty remark that is happening. But it's so precise that I think it's just a thrill to watch, and it's kind of, to me, the sort of ideal of like elevated movie dialogue at its best. I don't know, as far as like what connects these various Hawks movies for me, you know, the two things I think of, one, you mentioned the sort of emphasis on people versus plot. I don't always remember the plots of Hawks movies, and so much of them, the plots are kind of beside the point. He's really attuned to character and to this is even another like Soderbergh comparison, like to what makes a movie star, and how to best use kind of their persona in really interesting ways and play different personas off each other. You know, those comedies like Bringing Up Baby or His Girl Friday are really notable for the era because they have these really fiery, strong female characters in them. That are arguably smarter than all the other men in the room. And you know, his Western movies are hangout movies. They're not as plot focused as like a John Ford Western movie, and are not as sort of I don't know, it enveloped in kind of the myth of the Old West. They're just sort of like, here are these movie stars, let's just like hang out with them on a cattle drive for 2 hours. And the other thing that's probably like the biggest I don't know, the thing that immediately comes to mind with Hawks is professionalism. He's, I think, like maybe the best filmmaker at giving you the pleasure of just watching people who are really good at their job just do their job. Like I was watching over Thanksgiving, my family had never seen Broadcast News before, the great James L. Brooks movie. And
so good.
We watched that, and you're just sort of reminded watching something like that of like the part of the thrill and pleasure of that movie is just like watching these people who are so good at their job, and where the work and the people you work with are just, that's your life, and the pleasure and thrill that they both bring to it and get out of it from each other. And that's kind of how I would describe most of Hawke's movies, whether it's the cattle herders in something like Red River, or the pilots in Only Angels Have Wings, or a direct media comparison, His Girl Friday, like that's set in a newspaper office. And so with this movie, I think he's giving you sort of the pleasure of great detective work, and is maybe not as interested in how does like clue A connect to clue B, but of watching Bogart play just like a really professional detective who like knows what he's doing, and seeing the way he kind of examines a room and kind of gets himself in and out of trouble really conveniently, as well as just like like you said, understanding this kind of sexual chemistry that, as it turns out, was real between Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall, and understanding that is maybe I'm going to take a stance and say is even more important than the plot. I'm one of those people that's just people don't care about the plot of movies. What stays with us are these sort of like moments, whether they're sequences or set pieces or like something an actor does. But I think he very instinctively knows actors and knows movie stars, and I think what stands out to you about this movie as you're watching it is that professionalism in Bogart's character, as well as just sort of like the electricity you see of like two people who want to, like, can I swear on this podcast?
Yeah, go for it. I've been putting explicit warnings.
Okay, I mean, like the thrill of watching two people who want to fuck each other, like just interact, like, I don't know. That to me is, I think, how this kind of fits in with his other movies. He's making a movie about like a really good detective, and as well as like knows that part of the appeal of the movie is watching this kind of like real life couple sort of like bounce off each other through their chemistry.
Yeah, I'll read actually. So I'm among sort of many of my critical influences, one of my favorite sort of volumes to continuously return to is Roger Ebert's sort of great movies essays. Those were sort of the first real substantive criticism that I encountered as a young teenager, and I always return to them even as I sort of branch out into other stuff. But he has a great quote about this film that touches on exactly what you talk about, so I'll read it and encourage anyone to go check it out all the same. So he goes, "Some bad guys get killed and others get arrested, and we don't much care, because the real result is that Bogart and Lauren Bacall end up in each other's arms. The Big Sleep is a lust story with a plot about a lot of other things." So you're exactly right. I mean, that people are coming to see the celebrities, these sort of wonderful actors who sort of do have at this point this sort of well-known off-screen romance. And I mean, and that's sort of a carry on throughout the Hawks filmography, but also the one sort of, it's also the major notable difference between, we talked a lot about those other LA detective stories that, because the other thing that Ebert touches on and every critic touches on basically is that, yes, the plot is very confusing. It's confusing for Marlowe. It's confusing for us. Not even the people who made the movie knew what the hell was going on. It was, it's a confusing. Chandler doesn't know. Hawks doesn't know. We don't know. There's certain stuff. It's mostly easy to follow, but there's certain stuff that remains sort of elusive. And, and so that's the sort of, it exists in that same sort of, like you said, this sort of post-war malaise, which is the sort of key phrase that's always associated with film noir. But it's also a very different kind of noir. Film noir is sort of, in some ways, though some critics would obviously take issue with this, a descendant of German Expressionism. And in German Expressionism, there's these sort of weak and pathetic male figures who always end up sort of ensnared in a web beyond their own control, and it often ends with with their own demise. I mean, some of the sort of poverty row noirs, like Edgar J. Ulmer's Detour, fit within this thing. Even the sort of neo noirs from even the last like 20 years, like the Coen brothers, The Man Who Wasn't There would be another film that sort of exists with these weak male figures. The femme fatale noir comes with its own sort of trappings. And so, the interesting thing about this, compared to the noirs of the 70s, Marlowe and the audience and everyone else involved may not fully know what's going on, but like you said, there's this air of professionalism. He's still always in control. Things are happening, as some of the reviews indicate, at this screwball pace. Things are happening quickly. There's this sort of pitter pat, like you said, Sorkin, or obviously not Sorkin influence, but Sorkin probably took this as an influence, this sort of back and forth dialogue from this and His Girl Friday, which remains this sort of Hawks hallmark. But, in the end, Marlowe's still in control, and, there is no sort of real noir ending where there's this sort of devastating coda. Everything ends pretty well. I mean, like you said, it's the pleasure of watching two people who really want to get in bed with each other, and they do. And so, yeah, I mean, it's this sort of delight. There's no forget it, Jake, it's Chinatown, or the sort of tragic ending to The Long Goodbye, or even just the sort of hazy confusion of the end of Inherent Vice. The plot doesn't matter, not necessarily to the extent that it confuses us, but that, we still feel like we're in good hands with Philip Marlowe, and he still sort of has everything under control, which is what makes this film sort of an interesting example. It has sort of the atmosphere and mood of film noir. It has sort of some of the character types. You could stretch and kind of say that Lauren Bacall is a femme fatale, but she's a femme fatale that really wants to, that they end up together, which does not happen in many noir stories. I mean, you could look at like Orson Welles' The Lady from Shanghai, and that sort of the prototypical femme fatale character. But yeah, and I'm glad you to sort of pull on another thing that you mentioned earlier. I'm glad you mentioned the Hangout film. That has been I wrote my undergraduate thesis partially on that idea, and Hawks is sort of actually the origin point for what I sort of propose as an entire mode of filmmaking. And definitely I saw that when I was browsing through Letterboxd this morning. I saw you added Rio Bravo to your watch list, and I'm like, yeah, that's sort of the quintessential hangout film. And I kind of feel like Only Angels Have Wings is sort of its closest connection in the Hawks filmography, even more so than I take that back. Hawks remakes Rio Bravo essentially twice. Once with John Wayne and Robert Mitchum in El Dorado, and another movie with John Wayne called Rio Lobo. So El Dorado, obviously, and Rio Bravo were all both sort of in the hangout mode, but Only Angels Have Wings as well, much more than Red River, which, though it is sort of a film where we're just spending time with the characters, has a much more sort of directional plot where it's like, okay, we have to get these cattle from point A to point B.
Or
Rio
like
Bravo,
you mentioning Only Angels Have Wings, like they're just hanging out in a bar in that movie.
Yeah,
like they're just in the officers club, and with like a couple like, or like Cary Grant's office or something. Like everyone's just sort of like coming in and out of the sort of same spaces essentially.
Yeah, and most hangout films are ultimately, at least theoretically, the way I sort of defined the mode is that a lot of them have to do with sort of interpretations of masculinity and sort of, so Rio Bravo is very much a film about masculinity, and so is Only Angels Have Wings, and so Hawks has sort of different masculine figures. Another sort of film that I've already mentioned this on this episode once that I sort of centrally focus on as the sort of consummate hangout film of the contemporary period is Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, which he's actually the guy that coins the term. He's the first person to, as far as I know, he's the first person to define the hangout film. he sort of I would encourage anyone to look up more of what he says. I tried to expand upon it in my own work, but his whole thing is that it's a movie where the characters become your friends to a certain extent. That's certainly the case in Rio Bravo, which is the film he focuses on, and it's mostly the case in a lot of Hawke's films. But I also think that, you know, we're hanging out with characters, yes, but we're also, you know, if we want to sort of draw on the fact that, you know, Hawks himself and every critic goes, okay, the plot of The Big Sleep doesn't really matter. Okay, then what are we really doing in The Big Sleep? We're basically, it's not a hangout film per se, and neither is His Girl Friday, and neither is Bringing Up Baby. They all just move at such a quick pace that I don't think they fit within the sort of definition. The hangout film relies on a certain mode of slowness that you know, is essential to its affect. And I would say, just to throw in a couple examples of, like, Dazed and Confused is like another major hangout film. And so, you know, these films don't necessarily rely on that to it really at all, but you can see in this sort of shift from plot based to sort of a reliance on the sort of screen, you know, the star images of these different figures. We're really just spending time with them, and, you know, watching their chemistry and watching them, you know, flirt and try to solve this mystery. And so it sort of represents a fusion of Hawks's sort of reliance on movie stars. I mean, there's very few movies where he doesn't. I mean, he makes Gentlemen Prefer Blondes with Marilyn Monroe in the 50s. You know, very few movies where Hawks isn't working with sort of major stars. And so, you know, I think it's this interesting sort of, it's a noir film that also doesn't take all of the noir characteristics to its natural conclusion. I mean, if you want to compare it to like another film from this around the same time, like Fritz Lang's Scarlet Street, like very different noir traditions. This is sort of the detective story versus the sort of weak male noir, which sort of deals in these sort of complex gender stereotypes. But anyways, I have gone off on a long tangent about this. So yeah, sorry, I did not realize how long I was talking
good.
for.
I mean, this is your podcast. I mean, the only thing I was just thinking of is, like, I just wish more filmmakers today, I mean, maybe they're out there, they just don't get the opportunities. I would just kill for, like, someone who just, like, instinctively know, more people who just instinctively know what it is about certain people to kind of get us to the movie screens, if that makes sense. Of, like, you know, in that kind of Hawks lineage of it, the plot is maybe secondary to, and I mean, there are movies that I think are great because of their stories, but I mean, I don't know, I think I don't want to be the guy on here who's just like bash Marvel or something, but, you know, I think the appeal of those movies to an extent is sort of like, how do the dots connect between this sort of like larger functioning story, you know what I mean? And of like, I don't know, I also, this is going to sound terrible, I wonder what, like, the Howard Hawks version of Tenet would be, knowing that, like, you just watch that and of like, that's a movie that, like, drives me crazy because of, like, you know, without turning this into a Tenet podcast, of like how much that movie is plot, and of just like, I would just kill for just sort of like that movie's plot to be as secondary as I think some people have argued, and to be more of like, I don't know, Miami Vice with with Sean David Washington and Robert Pattinson. I mean, I think that's just a mode of movie making that's just, I think, sadly not in fashion now. It's just to rely on stars and to rely on people in our movies as the thing that kind of gets the seat in the butt. I don't know, this is just my little call for, like, more of that, please, because I think that's something that I really respond to in movies, is when I just sort of see the electricity between people on screen and can make kind of even the most sort of like mundane, dumb things into like extravagant works of entertainment or art.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think part of the sort of difference is that, you know, I think your Marvel point is very interesting because that's something I've thought about for a long time, and something I discussed in a lot of like film history classes in college, where, you know, uh, people have talked about Marvel in a lot of ways, trying to connect it to film history. People go, oh, well, it's, you know, a producer driven model, and like, you know, Kevin Feige's like David Selznick. It's like, okay, all right, just calm down. But I think the biggest and most interesting sort of discrepancy between the contemporary sort of Marvel model is that the characters are now the star. So, you know, no one gives a shit about watching Robert Downey Jr. play Dr. Doolittle. I mean, truly, no one cares. You put him in the Iron Man suit, though, people are going to be there opening weekend. And so then you have to ask yourself, is Chris Evans a star outside of the Marvel movies? I don't know. Not really. I mean, you put him in an ensemble with a bunch of people like in Knives Out, maybe people will show up, you know, but you put Chris Hemsworth in Black Hat, no one really cares. You know, so there's this sort of interesting difference where, you know, back in the day, it was people went to go see the stars. People went to go see Bogart. They went to go see Bacall. They went to go see Ingrid Bergman. They went to go see Cary Grant and Jimmy Stewart and Katharine Hepburn. And now they go see Thor, and they go see Captain America, and they go see Iron Man, or they go see Batman. It doesn't really matter who's playing them, as long as they're playing that character in the way that we've anticipated them to. And so it's this weird little dynamic. And I think part of it can be traced to the fact that, you know, Bogart played variations of similar characters. I mean, Rick Blaine in Casablanca is not Sam Spade in The Maltese Falcon, and Sam Spade in The Maltese Falcon is not quite Philip Marlowe in The Big Sleep. But, you know, when you have these actors that have a very particular set of skills, I sound like Liam Neeson in Tenet, but, you know, when they or not Tenet and Taken, good lord,
that would be a
whoa, that's
whoa, what's that
whole
movie?
whole different movie. But, you know, when you have, you know, people go see, you know, when once again, it's like John Wayne's character in Rio Bravo is not Ethan Edwards in The Searchers, but, you know, people went to go see John Wayne because John Wayne was the character. Like Cary Grant, you didn't pay to go see Humphrey Bogart, the real human being, or Cary Grant, the real human being. You paid to see the star image. And, you know, obviously I don't, you know, star studies is not my area of expertise in like academic film criticism. So if any like star studies scholars ever come across this podcast, I know that I'm like severely lacking in that, but that's just sort of my, you know, gut feeling about the difference and why, you know, for people who are really into sort of classic Hollywood films, why these films remain somewhat, you know, still appealing to this day as sort of an antidote to, a sort of starless system. And even the sort of modern star system has changed where it's more about seeing an actor, you know, play different roles and see how they can stretch themselves. So even, you know, the sort of, you know, ultimate hangout film of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, which is one of the few films from the last few years that has relied on stars to sort of drive its box office revenue. So the sort of experience of hanging out with Rick Dalton and Cliff Booth and Sharon Tate, but also the experience of hanging out with Leonardo DiCaprio and Brad Pitt and Margot Robbie. You know, that sort of was the appeal there. And so it was part of the sort of, for me, that movie is the last of a sort of dying tradition of filmmaking. That sort of, you know, the plot in that movie is, you know, pretty perfunctory. It's character driven. And then, you know, in the third act, you know, shit goes down and people have to save the day. And so, you know, it's a very different age we're living in. And no, I think I did watch Tenet last night. I won't talk about it too much. I liked it more than most. That's
just the only like thing that's because I'm seeing all these people catching up with it. That's just like the first thing that came into my mind. And I just remember like my kind of biggest takeaway leaving it was just like, I want more, I want more movie starness in this as opposed to
Yeah.
sort of like Christopher Nolan in front of like a whiteboard explaining how everything works to me.
Yeah. No, I mean he's a very different. I mean, if there is a filmmaker who is more diametrically opposed to the Hawk style of filmmaking, I can't think of one. I mean, he's really sort of a different type of filmmaking, and yeah, I mean, but it's another one where you know, the plot itself is very complicated, but can also, like The Big Sleep, be understood in these sort of simple terms where it's like, you know, okay, The Big Sleep, all right, someone's blackmailing someone and we have to figure this out, and there's all these characters involved, and somehow it'll come together in the end, so long as we get to watch you know, Bogart and Bacall use racehorse metaphors to talk about sex. And so, you know, with Tenet, it's just like, okay, they have to go get a thing to do a thing to stop a thing from happening, and everything will be okay in the end. So, you know, different movies that sort of, you know, in different ways of minimizing and intensifying plot. But yeah, so yeah, any final thoughts on The Big Sleep, on Howard Hawks in general, or LA Noir? Anything? Any final recommendations?
Just bring back movie stars, please. That's it. Just
More
bring
movie stars.
More movie
We need
stars. Come on, like I don't want to go down the Tom Cruise rabbit hole, but like, hasn't part of the fun of this Tom Cruise rant just been like, we get to talk about Tom Cruise again, and just like the persona of that man,
the future of this industry. That's what I sleep with at night.
Oh
yes,
gosh,
love it.
It's just my lifeblood at this point.
It's so good. It's so good. No, yeah, I mean, we are sort of quickly approaching a movie starless future, and yeah, I'm not too thrilled about it. So, you know, but it's a very different system and a very different world, and I wish we had more directors like Hawks making movies, and I wish we had more sort of stars like Bogart and Bacall. They make more movies after this. I think they go on to do Dark Passage with Delmer Daves, and then Key Largo with, I think, John Huston. So there really are this sort of star package, like many sort of figures were back in the day. You know, Cary Grant and Katharine Hepburn make a bunch of movies together, and you know,
also just the one thing I kind of have to mention about Humphrey Bogart, because it's going to seem weird if like we don't discuss him at all on this podcast because he's such a big star. But like, I was kind of just like caught off guard of like, I think the perception we have of Humphrey Bogart is just this kind of like rugged man's man sort of person.
Yeah.
And I don't know, there's a sadness to him, and there's a sort of exhaustion, and you know, I think it's just interesting to like go back and see some of these movies that these kind of like big iconic stars of this era, and that they are more nuanced stars than I think we give them credit for. And I think Humphrey Bogart is just like tough guy who got it done and was just the badass in the room, and just like told them women what's what, or whatever the like weird alt-right take on Humphrey whatever the like weird like some schmo at the Daily Wire is saying, like that's a man right there, like whatever that take is, it's actually more nuanced than that, and him actually being someone who is much more kind of like hangdog and kind of like just feels like he's had like the weight of the world on his shoulders for like 30 years and kind of just looks exhausted. And I think that's what makes him so great in movies like this, or the Maltese Falcon, or especially Casablanca, or rewatching that recently with my girlfriend who loved it. And just like, I don't know, who would thunk like Humphrey Bogart is like love torn person who's like had a ton of heartbreak, but like he fits the mold because of that kind of like energy he gives off of just being like, feels like he's gone through the ringer for years and years.
Yeah, and I think that sort of represents the core of what we were talking about of this film, sort of where it fits in the film noir tradition of, if film noir is a genre, I mean, like taking Chinatown as an example of, you know, Jack Nicholson's a character who has a little bit of sort of world weariness about him, but he's also a very brash and sort of confident figure. And the film then systematically sort of dismantles his own, you know, it makes him sort of realize once again that he's really powerless. And that's the case on a lot of the sort of, especially the non-detective noirs. As I learned in my 70s film class, there's certainly an acute difference between the detective noir and the sort of noir where sort of an ordinary guy gets caught up in a difficult situation and ends up at the mercy of different forces. And so, you know, but what makes Bogart such an interesting figure in those films is, you're right, he does have this world weariness about him where, you know, the depths of the perversion and depravity and the horrors of the world may be shocking to us, but it's just business to him. And it's, you know, he's already, like you said, he's already sort of living with this and carrying this along with him. And so, you know, the only real solace for him is getting, you know, getting Lauren Bacall at the end. And certainly this is a much more sort of upbeat ending than, I'm not sure if you've seen The Maltese Falcon or how recently, but I rewatched that recently, and man, that's a dark ending.
Yes.
That one's really grim.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I mean, and you're right.
I mean, it's like there was like a Pauline Kael quote that I kept thinking about watching this and watching Bogart, where she compares Bogart to Eastwood, and like, if you haven't looked up what Pauline Kael has to say about Eastwood, it's just the typical, just like the most like nastiest shit you could imagine saying to someone, but of like, you know, I think she kind of compares, like, you know, when Clint Eastwood kills in this movie, like, he's the Terminator. Like, it's just this, like, it like, it does.
It's like the end of Unforgiven when he's awoken finally, and it's just like, I watched that recently for the first time, so
it's just like even more, it's just like, that's business. Like, that's it doesn't affect him in any way. Whereas like when Bogart kills someone in a movie, like, you see on that face the sort of like pain and torment and regret, and like it they don't need to acknowledge it, of like, you see it on his face, and the way that his sort of cheeks kind of sag slightly and his eyes look baggy, and just like, that's what killing people does to someone. And I don't know, I thought that was just like a very smart observation that I've thought of every time I've sort of seen him in a movie, since like reading that. I forget what movie it's for, but ever since I read that review, that's what I think about every time I see a Humphrey Bogart movie.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But you're also right in talking about Casablanca, which is my favorite movie of all time. I adore that film. And like you said, there's also, you know, there's regret and world weariness, but also a sort of romanticism to Bogart. You know, he's a character who can be a romantic at heart, obviously, with as Claude Rains' character says at the end of Casablanca, you're a sentimentalist deep down. So, you know, even in this movie, you know, he has this sort of just business attitude and is able to navigate this criminal web, but does clearly have real sympathy for Vivian Rutledge and her sister Carmen. And no, I love Howard Hawks' movies, and this film is a delight and sort of an interesting. The noir genre keeps developing throughout the 50s, and this is sort of an earlier example of it, and especially of the detective movie tradition, and sort of the, you know, the focal point for this entire sort of subgenre, which is, like you said, the LA noir. So if you want, like, you know, like a whole weekend marathon, just like Big Sleep, Long Goodbye, Chinatown, Inherent, but just watch them all, and it would be great. So, but yeah, so thanks for coming on, Jesse. This was a really fun conversation, and yeah, Hawks is one of my favorite filmmakers, and I've watched a lot of his films this year. So glad to have a chance to talk about that, and The Big Sleep, which is probably one of my favorites from him. So
agreed.
Yeah. So anything the listeners should be on the lookout over at Film Inquiry on the latest? What have been the recent podcasts?
I mean, we recently, I had you on to talk about Mank, and you provided a lot of great, Hollywood history insight into that movie. And, a lot of movies are kind of being trickled out through the end of the year. So
Yeah.
I think, there's an episode up on Nomadland. I'm sure we're going to have a big Christmas episode talking about like Soul and Wonder Woman. So I think if you're interested in, getting some takes on the latest, wow, just shoving the name of the podcast in the top. Yeah. We're a lot of good stuff coming up around the corner, as like a lot of people are dropping Christmas releases.
Awesome. Yeah, no, looking forward to that, and interested to hear what you and your guests have to say about a lot of those movies. And so, I think we'll be coming back with more episodes soon. I've got sort of a lot of stuff that I'm trying to work out. Busy time of year for everyone, though. But I think Jesse will be back soon to talk about A Star is Born with Judy Garland, the second of 4 iterations of that classic story. So thank you for tuning in to this episode. A little bit longer than our normal episodes, but it was a good conversation. We had a lot to talk about. So, thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.